Nellie set it up perfectly for me. I think that dramaturgy is one of the most sort of mysterious branches or disciplines of theater. I regularly have friends of mine, people who have degrees in theater and who work in theater say, but what does a dramaturg actually really do? And so today, my goal is to make sure that all of us feel like we can confidently answer that as a group, and to share some language for all of you, to have kind of be on the same page and have some common shared language as a cohort for your practice. Because at the core of it, dramaturgy is about being, to me, a good explorer of worlds and a good communicator of that exploration. And so I'm going to keep coming back over the course of the day, and I'll put the sheet, the 2-page sheet that you got before this in the chat. So keep coming back to that sheet today, because we'll keep referencing it, and I'll add some more links as we go throughout the day. But there are 3 images I want to keep coming back to all day long. And the first is the actual definition of dramaturgy. And dramaturgy is the process of exploring the world of a play, both its source text and how that text engages with our reality, and then making textual, design, and performance choices that can bring that world richly to life. That's written down on that 2 sheet. I want to keep coming back to it, and we'll be talking in a couple of minutes with a practicing dramaturg who's Berlin-based, who can also tell me if she disagrees with that definition, and if so, why. But there's 2 other images that I want to share briefly as well, and I'll try doing a screen share and see how we do. Here we go. So I think a lot about 2 images of being an explorer of worlds and being a magnet. And the first one, this comes out of this article that we took a look at and we'll dig into later in the morning, of Eleanor Duke's visit to a small place. And she full world practicing dramaturgy to literally take the world of a play or the world of a text and medium-sized ball, hold it out in your hands and squint a little bit. And to make the world small enough to see it, big enough to still detail. And I think a lot of that coming back to this practice and this thought throughout the day. So that's being explorer. And the second part is being magnet. There's a direct-based editor in Chicago named Anna Shapiro who talks about all art as if being a magnet over metal filings. You'll pick up some, but not all. Some will pull strongly, some will pull less. And I think anytime that we as artists interact with a source text, this is what happens, that there are going to be pieces that we interact with strongly, pieces that less so. And so this process of dramaturgy is really acting as the explorer and as the magnet, and being able to toggle back and forth between that. So I'll start there. A little bit of an overview for today. So you've got the schedule in front of you, and we'll be a little bit flexible because I know that learning over Zoom for a lot of hours in a row can be sort of exhausting. So my goals for today, again, are to give this shared language around dramaturgy and a couple of tools that I really love and that I find flexible and useful for working in a lot of different contexts. And then I'm hoping that by the time you leave today, you feel comfortable with these definitions, that you feel comfortable with a couple of these tools that we practice, and maybe you have some more words to talk about and to talk with collaborators about the work that you're already doing. So in this first hour, we'll jump into conversation with a dramaturg and dear friend of mine, Antonia Tretter, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. After that, we'll take a couple of hours to play with this Mapping Small Worlds tool from this Visit to a Small Planet article. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit more about civic and social practice and putting some terms and some thoughts to work that you're probably already doing in community. And I like to work really collaboratively. Zoom can make that hard sometimes, but I welcome you at any point. I know folks are staying on mute, but feel free to unmute if you want to say something, like to consider that a hand raise, or to put questions in the chat throughout. I also have a tendency to get a little excited and talk fast. So if any point you're feeling like we need to slow down, if we need to go back over something, feel free to put that in the chat too. Let's take a pause, let's take a breath, and so on. Does that work for everybody? I'll also accept nods.
You are amazing. And you have a
Fantastic.
special guest as well. I mean, you know, this is like first time it happens. This is great. Amazing.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I was particularly excited about this opportunity because, as Nellie mentioned, I come from a theater background and I work now inside of a little bit more public policy around nightlife governance. And reading all of your bios and reading all of your backgrounds, you come from such a wide range of geography, of artistic backgrounds, training, and the idea of a practical dramaturgy and being able to offer that to this group and tools that you can use. I'm psyched about that. So without further ado, I'm really, really excited today to be in conversation with Antonia Tretter. And it feels fitting that she and I actually met in Amsterdam about 10 years ago. And I know that were the world different at the moment, we might be there. But she is a theater researcher, a dramaturg, and a Berlin-based theater scholar who has developed 18 productions at the Main Frankentheater Würzburg, and she's also worked as a freelance dramaturg, and she'll talk a little bit about how those two things are different today. She's assisted and interned with directors including Ivo van Hove, and she is currently working on a PhD about the political dimensions of dramaturgy. And so I think that specifically today, what's really great is that she's spending time in her PhD thinking about both the dramaturg as an actor in an artistic process and how they interact in an institution. And she has a lot of interest and a background in interdisciplinary and site-specific exchange and work. And so I think that might hit on some of the various practices and things that you all are working on. So I encourage you, please ask questions in the chat throughout. My thought is that she and I will talk a little bit. I've got some questions for her, and then we can open it up to the group. So without further ado, Antonia, please unmute yourself and come say hello.
Hey, hi everyone. Nice to meet you online, and I'm really happy to be here in this exciting space and in this University of the Underground. And I'm really curious about our chat and about your questions.
Great. So I will jump in. I know that I have already offered a definition for dramaturgy, but for you in your work or when you're explaining what you do to somebody that you're just meeting, how do you define dramaturgy as a practice? And maybe what are the biggest misconceptions about it?
Well, when listening to you, I instantly had to smile because it sounded like a really romantic and ideal image of a dramaturg, and I really like that idea and definition as well. And I think when I decided to become a dramaturg, this was one of my ambitions, to be an explorer, and also to be this kind of magnet that is networking. But maybe today I'm representing first a quite traditional version of a dramaturg, because in Germany this kind of theater profession has a really long tradition, and in Germany we have those municipal theaters that are really big institutions as well. And when you work, I often start explaining working over there is a completely different thing from working as a freelance dramaturg. And so for the last 3 years, I have been working in a municipal theater, which was a quite challenging and rich experience at the same time. And you always oscillate between theater being an institution and being a production house for art and theater, music theater, dance theater, whatever, to come out. And at the same time, you have to manage things, you have to organize things, you have to communicate a lot. You're connected to PR and marketing department within the theater. And you're also doing kind of community work in saying, well, with which organizations or associations in the city we are in can we collaborate? Can we have projects with? And so you have to think about those aspects as well as, of course, accompanying productions and being this kind of conceptual outside eye, which also changes a lot depending on which production you're in. So as you already mentioned, I have accompanied 18 productions over there, for example, and those have been completely different productions. So I have done the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. I have done a research project working with documentary theater tools. I have done classical texts as well as contemporary plays. So this is a really wide range that you can jump into. And I think I've learned a lot from it, and I can share some of that experience with you.
Great. So for you, when you're approaching a new work, what are the first questions that you ask? I know that you've mentioned in past writing of yours that so much of dramaturgy is knowing the right questions to begin with. So when you're first beginning with a new work, and maybe you can speak in both the municipal theater institutional context and also freelance, what is maybe the first question?
Well, in municipal theater, it's quite interesting because you have to work quite early together with the stage designer, of course, and the director, because they have to come up with a concept for the stage, which has to be done 6 to 8 months before the premiere. So the first question would be, where are we in? Which world are we in? What kind of world do we want to put on stage? What time do we want to narrate, and which time zone and are we in? So this is quite a basic question to ask in the beginning, and I think it counts for every kind of story you want to tell. So either it's a classical play or a contemporary play, you have to ask that question. And also, who are we? Who is telling that story? Who is our audience? And that's also something which is always really, really important. And who do we want to tell this story for? I think is also, for institutional and freelance backgrounds, really important question.
Great. And perhaps, I don't know if you have an example in mind that you maybe can share. I think especially because I know that all of you as Research Bureau participants have a project, and I want to hear much, much more about that later today, where the work that you do has to be contextualized inside the institution that you're working in. Especially in that context, how does that last question, what's our audience and who are we? How has that maybe changed a production as you've approached it?
Well, I think there's a really strong connection between the space you are doing the work in and the way you are working on it. So I had, for example, one production which was performed on site-specific place, and it was a totally different experience from the ones we did inside a theater, either on the big stage or in a small black box. So working on site within the urban space, you could say, in particular case, it was a really small cellar beyond an old university building. And it had so many different dimensions, differing from the experience that we had in the theater, because of course you have a totally different infrastructure. So the relation to the audience changed completely, because the distance between audience members and performers was almost not there, and you didn't have that distance that you're used to when you're going to the theater and being able to sit relaxed in your seat and feeling comfortable in the beginning. But you had a totally different feeling approaching the place, and also performing there, being an audience member or not, being a performer or not. So I think that's quite interesting also to look at where are we in and how is the relationship between audience and performers.
Yeah, so you're starting to highlight a few themes that I know will keep coming up throughout the day. So talking about both how we read or draw meaning from a space, but also how we are, if we're sitting comfortably, if we're not, if we have to stand up. So that sense of space, that sense of time, time set within the storytelling, but also the time we're telling something in. And then who are we and who are they? Who are we as the storytellers, and who are they as the audience? So though we're starting to talk about those first questions, take me through a little bit of the process if you're working on a specific production of beginning to realize that world. And I have some of your pictures here. If you want me to pull anything up, just let me know.
Okay. So after you have this kind of idea in which world you're going to stage that play or that project, that's whatever, I think it's quite important to follow that line of narration, which doesn't necessarily have to be a logical or linear line of narration, but it could also be a pattern, or it could be, a constellation that you arrange things around, that you put different emotions, happenings, different. I think it's quite useful always to ask, what is our red line? What is our pattern? And are we still following that pattern or that line? But I also think it's quite useful to agree on this kind of idea collectively, and not just to be, the outside eye saying, well, I know best and I know what is going to be the right decision in the end, but to try to agree collectively on that kind of common idea of what do we want to approach, what is our goal, do we have a goal at all, or do we just keep going with the flow, which could also be just fine, of course. And then there are different stages, of course. Working in an institution, you have like a fixed time schedule. So you'd have the final rehearsals at the end, and you have to come up with something because it's going to be controlled in a way by the theatre manager who wants to see an outcome in the end. So you have stage rehearsal, which is important. And beforehand, I think it's really interesting to collaborate with the actors or with the performers on the different steps of putting it together, and kind of keeping a communal spirit kind of idea that everybody is driven by. Because sometimes I had the experience that there was a director having an idea and there was an actor absolutely not being able to follow what this idea was about, positions. And I think in many cases solve it, but in some cases you can't, because the personalities are too strong and the conditions are so fixed within an institution. It's sometimes hard to work against that. So that may be the advantage of working in freelance theatre projects or in freelance art projects, to be able to choose the persons you want to work with and to agree beforehand which working conditions you want to establish, and also in what ways you want to work together, because that's also something that really hit me with it when working in an institution, that all of a sudden those hierarchies and preconditions of an institution also affected me, although I didn't want to be, the institutional dramaturge that is the outside eye and is the strict and all-knowing person. So yeah.
So there, and one thing I want to first come back to is this notion of maybe two collaborators, and I've certainly had this experience, who seem to be living in different dramatic worlds.
Yeah.
That perhaps the director is working sort of upon one understanding of the creative world that is putting forth, and there's an actor or another creator who's telling a different story. How do you, as a dramaturg, what tools do you use to try to communicate what is sometimes then really abstract or hard to grasp, to mediate that?
So first of all, I'd try to talk to the director without maybe the other participant or the other performer, because in many cases, I think there are like presumptions or expectations in the mind of a creator, in the mind of a theater director, that may be an obstacle to really communal way of working together. So I'd try to ask, well, do you expect the emotion or attitude or whatever from the specific person? And then in maybe communicating with the two of them, I'd always try to come back to the project that we all are working together on, and always trying to emphasize there is no such idea that is upon anyone, which is really I think it's an important issue to try to change forces within a theatre production, and to be able to create an energy that everybody can flow with, and that everybody can also understand logically, like why are we doing this particular text, for example? Why do we have to tell that story today? Why is it interesting at all? I think that's something you have to really talk about quite often, and always again and again. And I don't think there's a certain point when you should say, well, you should have understand that by now. I think it's always allowed to ask questions. It's always allowed to be critical about telling stories, because there's so much knowledge and tradition affecting us. So we always should be really sensitive about it. And I think those processes are also marked by experience. So actors, especially if they have been working for an institution for a really long time, they have had negative experiences. They have had experiences when they really worked against their personalities. And I think it's really important to see that, and to see, well, nobody comes in an artistic process and is completely free of its personal experiences or its histories. And I think that's something a dramaturg can keep in mind, and can also remind all different actors and members of the performance to be really sensitive about that, and to develop a kind of empathy for each other.
Yeah, so you're really reading not just the worlds that are happening on stage or the world of the institution, but every single collaborator almost is having sort of their own world and their own force that they exert upon the thing that's being created. So your PhD focuses on the political dimensions of dramaturgy. If I can start with a big general question on that a bit, how do you see dramaturgy as being political?
Well, I have to differentiate that a little. So dramaturgy as a concept is, for me personally, in every way political, because you have to get to the bottom of it, and you have to ask, why are we doing theater at all, for example, and why do we why are we interested in that relation between performers and people looking at that performance? And so you always have power relations at stake, and you always have this kind of public sphere being created that is different from depending where you're doing theater, of course. But I think theater as a public sphere, and that this kind of space where we share this life experience, which is a quite rare experience right now, is unique, and that's something. Yeah, you can find reasons in history for that, but I think it should be enough for that point. And then working in an institution as a dramaturg is a really political practice, because you have to work for this institution, you have to perform certain attitudes, you have to defend certain values, certain imagination of arts, of our goals, of programs and concepts. So there's a policy being at stake, which is quite, I think you have to be quite critical about that as well. And so yeah, I talked about in my project three political dimensions, being polity, which means the institution and the theatre system, because in Germany a lot of theatres are publicly funded, and they have this kind of cultural policy value. And then there's policy concerning the content. So what plays do we play? Why do we play them? What is our program of the season? And then there's politics, meaning all the hierarchies, all the constellations, the relations between the people working in this theatre. And of course, there are vertical and horizontal hierarchies.
Yeah. Diving into that a little bit, thinking about where maybe the institution comes up against themes you want to talk about in the work. Have you experienced, or have you seen elsewhere in the theater world, a dramaturg or artist using work to sort of push an institution in a certain direction or force a conversation to happen? Because I imagine that probably a lot of you Research Bureau students are maybe thinking about how to use your art to kind of influence as a language tool.
Yeah, I think maybe from the 70s on in Germany, there have been attempts to try the institution from within, the theatre institution. So there have been like performance groups invited in theatres, trying to change that strict hierarchies and things like that. Unfortunately, none of this has come out positively. But I think today there are also I know theatres that invite to kind of the residency and looking at the hierarchies, looking at how often we meet, in what spaces do we meet, and reflecting on that and trying to share their knowledge and their experience with the theatre managers. But of course, it's always a clash of expectations, a clash of backgrounds, because when you work freelance, you have a totally different experience from being able to do your work and to be able to pursue your personal, spirits, and to follow your fantasies and your ideas. And within an institution, there are so many doors to cross, there are so many people to talk to, there are so many expectations, and also there's this long history, there's this huge structure. So it's really there's the feminist scholar Sara Ahmed talking about brick walls, and I love that idea because it totally shows you how you can experience an institution if you don't fit in the scheme of this institution. So if you are in any point different to the average that this institution is performing, then you push against that wall.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat that I want to give voice to, and maybe this is something that you loop back to, and I'm happy to pass things along after this morning, but whether you can share some examples of an intervention where artist groups or maybe a single artist challenged that brick wall of structure and institution.
So there's a theater in Freiburg in Germany. I can also write it to you later. And they had, I think, like 5 years ago, 8 to 5 years ago, they had a performance group being there, I think, for 2 years or something like that. And they even tried to change structures and did a project in changing the structure. Unfortunately, I haven't been there. I've just heard about it. I think that could be a nice example to dig into. And then, of course, here in Berlin at Volksbühne, there have been performances taking up the theater for like more than 24 hours, so for days. And this is, of course, something that challenges this institution and that totally changes the relation between audience and performers. So there is this, I think they are from Norway or from Denmark. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. It's a performance called, I have to look it up. It's a performance duo. So yeah, showcase wins. Yeah, that's a draw is set here.
Nice. So I want to think a little bit, maybe speculatively, that we've talked so far about the role of dramaturgy in a theater institution, and so in the discipline in which it has grown up. If you were, for example, asked to act as the dramaturg of a protest movement or of a political election campaign, where might you begin? What questions would you be asking of yourself and of a group?
I think I'd always beginning questioning ourselves. Who are we? What privileges do we have? What's our story? How do we come together? And then I tried to share anecdotes, share stories, share ideas, why we came to this point, why are we doing this thing together. And I think working on anecdotes for the very beginning of a rehearsal process or any artistic or political process, also in activism, can create an experience or can create a feeling of experiences for each other. And I've experienced that a lot in theater and also in activism. And I think when you're sharing those anecdotes, that stories, you sooner or later will come to that point that you discover patterns together, that you discover motives that repeat, you discover storylines that come up and are variated from context to context. And then you can decide, okay, do we want to fix a certain background or a certain context that we are trying to work in, or are we trying to be as open as possible, taking into account as many different forms of knowledge as possible, which is also a way of collecting things and could be a starting point, I think, for any research process. But I think finding patterns and finding structure is something you can easily come up with after sharing anecdotes and stories.
And maybe building another step on that process, like especially when I think about, political campaigns, for example, in the US that have been that have taken hold of popular imagination, sort of for better or for worse. They have really strong imagery, or they have things, refrains that come back. They seem to have built a very clear world. How might you think about kind of happening upon that creative process of what is an image that is going to be that repeat, or even a color scheme, or I think about graphic design. How do you work your way to that from that initial process you're talking about of defining a why, and then finding those patterns?
I think mind mapping is a really good technique, always, and also changing sites, going for a walk, going outside, changing spaces. I've had the experience that in each process, it is so refreshing to leave the space you're usually working in, and to also take your colleagues with you, you know, not being on your own, but taking them with you. It's not important how well you know each other. You can always go for a walk. This sounds so so basic, but it's so important. And to leave the institution, to leave your house, to leave your flat, and to walk somewhere else, I think is a really nice step. And I can see that someone reads Milo Rau and Stefan Blaeske, right? I visited them in February in Ghent, in Belgium, and there was a conference of dramaturgy, and I think they're really interesting example, and they're really it's really challenging to read their manifesto and to follow their approach in changing the institution. But still, what I could hear from them is also that they are failing a lot, and I think that is quite important note, perhaps, that failing is inherent, and you have to be willing to fail to achieve something. And of course, you will always face those brick walls, and those brick walls won't vanish just because you have stated that there is one wall. But you have I think it's important to talk about that, and to find, you know, allies you can fight with in this struggle.
And I know, especially for solo creators or freelancers, how how important the sort of cohort model is. And I hope that this program for all of you can become that sort of ally building process. There's a question here too about Augusto Boal and working with Theater of the Oppressed. And I wonder whether you have collaborated around projects that use those techniques, or if you know folks who have, and from a dramaturgical standpoint, what that's like.
Yeah, I mean, this is also a really ideal theory of working together with people who are not able to go to the theater, maybe
Can you just maybe remind them what is the Theater of the Oppressed, because not everyone will know what this is.
Of course. So I'll speak just a minute, and then Antonia, please also chime in. Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed work also grows out of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that sort of tears apart a bit of what we're doing right now, this notion of education as the stage on the stage, disseminating information kind of unidirectionally to an audience, and makes it participatory. And Boal has a series of games, and I have a couple links I can share with you later today to be a quick little introduction. But he thought about using theater as rehearsing for revolution in a way. And so his games and a very participatory mode of forum theater allows crowds and communities and groups in many different contexts to sort of rehearse possibilities for change, and to use theater to break cycles.
Yeah, maybe we can show some of the pictures because
Yeah.
we didn't decide to work with this particular theory in Würzburg, which is a small town in Bavaria, but we thought about ways to, yeah, you can leave that picture. We thought about ways of changing how this institution is perceived, and we tried to open up the institution to people who cannot afford going into the theater and seeing theater performances, and also people who don't speak German at all because they have just come to Germany as refugees. So we invented this format called W-Café, so W Café, which meant, so W stand for Würzburg, which is the city's name, but also for welcome and for we. And we tried to establish a platform, and this platform was held each month for 4 hours, I think. We opened the theater, and we didn't have any program. We had different spots, different ideas. We offered different things. We had a cafe bar, we had tea, we had soccer games, we had video games, we had instruments, we had everything a theater could offer. And then people would come in and meet each other. And so you can see we had this workshop with a rhythmic musician, and then you can skip through the other pictures. Maybe this, and the one afterwards. Yes. And in this picture, you can see a discussion we had in the institution, talking about job perspectives for refugees. And I think this picture shows quite well that you can try to open up, and you can try to invite different people, but you will always be in the institution. We're sitting there really officially, and it's it was a nice talk. It was a nice exchange of experiences and questions, and we had a Syrian guy over there, and we had a person from the working department of the city talking about how can we share experiences and ways of getting into jobs more easily, even if you're maybe not allowed to work over here and things like that. But you can see, this kind of architecture also shows it's a really traditional or official building, and you can't leave that architecture until you leave it. So you have to get out of space to leave that kind of, institutional background. So maybe you can show the one with the food.
Yep.
So in this platform, we also tried to do things you would not usually do in a theater. So we had this kind of humus kitchen, and encourage people just to share food and not to care about health regulation issues, and just to, come together, have a plate of hummus and chat. And it was really one of my most, I think, important experiences to try to establish this platform and try to change the way we're perceiving this theater within the city, and also to try to have people mingling up, because this was a really white and old audience I was confronted with for 3 years. So just
I'm thinking also about the work of Peter Sellers, the opera director, who incorporates sharing meals often into his work. And I think opera often, people have a perception of it as extremely institutional and maybe a lot of barriers to entry. And I think he incorporates food and meals very deliberately to try and undo or challenge some of that. So I'm seeing some similar comments here in the chat about tools for unlearning or for changing one's point of view. And I know that right now, kind of depending upon your public policy regulations where you are, some people can more easily go for a walk, perhaps than others, or at certain or different times of day. But I'm hoping maybe we can also be in conversation over the course of today about, in this moment where we can't necessarily have shared experience, or we can't necessarily, you know, physically be together or go on a collective walk, what are maybe some of the ways that we can accomplish those similar goals. I want to take a moment to hear from the Research Bureau a little bit about where this is intersecting with their work as it exists. So it's my understanding, as I've been reading your bios and kind of getting to know you before getting to know you, that people come from a huge range of disciplines. And I think some people are probably already working with dramaturgy in a very traditional sense, and some people maybe have been doing this without realizing it. So I want to invite you to just take about 60 seconds, and I'll time us, and I'll put myself on mute, to just write and jot down a couple of words about where are these ideas intersecting with your existing creative practice. And if the answer is it doesn't actually right now, that's okay too. So I'll put us on mute for a sec. So my timer is going off over here. So I want to invite any of the Research Bureau folks to share back. And if there are, I know we have folks here as well who aren't part of the Research Bureau and open to that too. Just in a couple of words, where is this intersecting for you right now? I have somebody named Smarties unmuted. Would you like to comment?
Why not? So from what I remember from my early classes, theater and dramaturgy was linked.
Great. I'm hearing like the link between theater and dramaturgy. And is that the discipline that you're kind of originally coming from as well?
We lost Antoine. Antoine, we lost you. Where are you? Where is he gone?
I'm there, but my connection is really bad. It's raining, and when it's rain, my Wi-Fi falls.
Antoine, is it easier to type in the box? And I'm happy to kind of relay back your thoughts if the connection is a little patchy.
I'll try.
I mean, you have maybe more inside the chat. I'm saying for Teme,
yeah.
Writing something. Where are you, for Teme?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I wrote what I was meant to say, but I am saying that actually I have a theater background, and I think that the most important aspect of what I have experienced is that the social gathering of theater gives us lots of possibilities, which I really try to find these kind of possibilities in what I'm doing. Um, everything that it is, I think that yeah, this brings some kind of possibilities which other kinds of experiences can give to us. Yeah.
Great. And is your practice also performance-based right now?
I don't know exactly in what medium it could be, but I'm trying to bring this aspect into my work. I don't know how yet. Yeah.
Great. Gaspar, I saw a comment from Gaspar here about the question of the dramaturgy of art and public space. Can I ask you to expand on that a little bit?
Sure, just a second. Actually, it's more of I'm willing to look more into these references and how dramaturgy really relates to what we're doing. And in the fine arts faculty, I feel it a bit really overlooked because they have a really strong difference from what is the language faculty or like the theater faculty, which is not even in the same place. But then you find yourself reading like Bourriaud, which is talking about relational aesthetics, and well, like art is living, and it's kind of missing some readings, I would say. But it's nice to see all these things popping up on the chat and the talk.
Yeah, I think that we'll get into today some tools that I hope can be applied to thinking about public space just as you would a text. And I think, Liam, you echoed this nicely about coming from a dance and performance working background. The idea of working from a source text is sort of does not compute in a bit of a way. And so, okay, so I appreciate that you're talking about dramaturgy as the tools and the symbols that you're bringing into the experience. But I wonder also, to what extent kind of reading a song in the way that we read a dramatic world in a script or a text can sort of apply similarly. That's great. And maybe one more, if somebody has put something in the chat and wants to expand.
Yeah, actually, Diana, I wanted to tell you it's going to be an hour. So maybe just maybe to say to all the visiting participants and students as well, that the next part will be just for the researcher, isn't it? Or
Yeah. So we'll wrap things up just in these next couple of minutes. And so before we close this hour, I'll Antonia a chance to say kind of last words, and if there is a good way to get in touch with her, if folks want to learn more, I'll share resources from her later today. But for the Research Bureau, I will have us take a quick 5 minutes. So once we close here, we'll take a quick 5 so you can grab coffee, take a stretch, and we'll come back together. But mostly, I want to thank all of you for your thought and reflection of where this is intersecting with you, and to really, really thank Antonia for joining us and sharing her perspective and kind of digging deep into a lot of aspects of what this often mysterious discipline can look like.